In 1884, a suffocating dread descended upon the rising city of Austin, Texas, long before the name Jack the Ripper ever haunted the streets of London. Over the next 12 months, a phantom armed with an axe committed a string of brutal midnight slaughterings, leaving behind a trail of 8 mutilated victims. The case included posed bodies, terrified vigilance committees, the famous Pinkerton detectives, and an impossibly elusive killer whose horrific reign would mark the very first chapter in the dark history of American serial murder. Hello and welcome to my channel. In late 1884, Austin, Texas was a city on the rise, barely 2 decades removed from the devastation of the Civil War. The state capital was undergoing a rapid and ambitious transformation. The population was swelling, railroads were connecting the once isolated town to the broader American economy, and the foundations were being laid for a monumental new state capitol building that would rival the architecture of Washington, D.C. The affluent residents of the city, residing in stately Victorian homes, felt a profound sense of optimism, shielded by an unwavering belief in their own security. But on December 30th, that innocence was shattered. The horror began in the quiet pre-dawn hours when the brutalized body of Molly Smith, a 25-year-old black cook, was discovered in the winter dirt just steps away from the home of her wealthy white employer, Walter Holmes. Molly had been viciously attacked while resting in her small, detached servants' quarters. The assailant had crept into the room without making a sound and struck her head with a heavy axe, delivering a blow of devastating, fatal force. Adding to the macabre nature of the crime, the killer then dragged her unconscious body out into the freezing night air, leaving her in the yard. The sheer savagery of the crime scene left local investigators bewildered. Yet, in the deeply segregated society of the American South in the late 19th century, the violent death of a black domestic worker was quickly rationalized and failed to trigger widespread alarm among the city's ruling class. To truly comprehend the landscape of these early killings, one must examine the specific social fabric of 1880s Austin. Following the abolition of slavery, a significant portion of the city's black female population found employment as maids, cooks, and childminders for prominent white families. These working-class women typically resided in modest, poorly secured wooden shacks located in the back alleys or rear gardens of their employers' grand estates. They lived in a perilous state of vulnerability, physically isolated from the protective walls of the main houses, yet entirely exposed to the dark, unlit alleys of the city. It was precisely this marginalized, unprotected demographic that the phantom killer meticulously selected for his initial campaign of terror. For several months after the demise of Molly Smith, an uneasy quiet settled over the city, and her death began to fade from the front pages of the local newspapers. Then, on the night of May 6, 1885, the killer emerged from the shadows once more. Eliza Shelley, another black cook who worked for a prominent former state senator, was discovered murdered in a remarkably similar, chilling fashion. The assailant had navigated the darkness with practiced ease, entered her quarters, and delivered a catastrophic axe blow to her head. Just as before, the victim was dragged from her bed into the outdoors. As the sweltering Texas summer approached, the violence escalated. More working-class black women, including Irene Cross and Mary Ramey, met the exact same gruesome fate. Each crime scene bore the undeniable ritualistic signatures of a highly organized and deeply disturbed mind. Despite the terrifying consistency of the murders, The local authorities stubbornly failed to recognize the larger, encroaching pattern. Blinded by the racial prejudices and sociological assumptions of the era, the Austin Police Department initially dismissed the string of killings as isolated incidents of domestic violence or racially motivated local revenge. Rather than hunting for a single, methodical serial killer, investigators focused their attention entirely on the victims' immediate circles. They swiftly arrested the women's husbands, boyfriends, and local acquaintances, subjecting these men to intense interrogations and, in some instances, attempting to extract dubious confessions to close the cases. This systemic investigative failure created a deadly, false sense of security. The affluent white citizens of Austin remained largely unconcerned by the bloodshed, secure in their prejudiced belief that this was a tragic but contained phenomenon, a violent anomaly that simply did not threaten their polished upper-class neighborhoods. They locked their doors at night, assuming the darkness only held danger for those living in the servants' quarters out back. The authorities clung desperately to the comforting illusion that they were dealing with ordinary, disconnected crimes. The police believed it was a localized issue within the servant community. They were gravely mistaken, and the brutality was only just beginning. As 1885 progressed, the bodies continued to pile up, revealing a chillingly consistent and gruesome modus operandi. Unlike crimes of passion or robberies gone wrong, these murders were executed with a cold, systematic precision that pointed to a single, highly organized perpetrator. The killer was not impulsive. He was a calculating hunter who studied his prey, navigating the pitch-black alleys and backyards of Austin without ever raising an alarm or leaving a trace of his arrival. The sequence of the attacks followed a terrifyingly uniform pattern that mirrored the clinical approach of a seasoned predator. The assailant would breach the modest, often poorly secured servant quarters in the dead of night, moving with absolute, unnatural silence. His victims were always targeted while they were in their most vulnerable physical state, fast asleep. Rather than engaging in a chaotic struggle, the killer utilized a heavy, bladed instrument, most commonly an axe or a hatchet gathered from the victim's own property, to deliver a devastating, paralyzing blow to the skull. The primary intent of this initial strike was seemingly not immediate death, but total, immediate incapacitation. What followed elevated these crimes from localized homicides to acts of profound psychological sadism. Once the victim was rendered completely unconscious and defenseless, the attacker would violently drag them from the perceived sanctuary of their beds. He hauled the heavily bleeding women out into the freezing night, repositioning them in the desolate, shadowy corners of the outdoor yards, gardens, or nearby fields. It was out in the open air, exposed to the harsh elements of the Texas winter, that the killer would complete his horrifying work, inflicting further, fatal lacerations and unspeakable physical violation. Yet it was the bizarre, ritualistic signatures left at the crime scenes that truly terrified investigators and cemented the killer's profile as a deeply disturbed psychopath. The bodies were never simply abandoned haphazardly in the dirt. They were deliberately and meticulously posed. The limbs were often arranged in specific theatrical postures, projecting a macabre sense of pride or serving as a twisted, silent message left for the police to discover at dawn. Most disturbingly, medical examiners noted a highly specific and chilling detail connecting the victims. The killer possessed a compulsion to insert a sharp object, such as a metal pin or a small wooden stick, deep into the victim's ears, This highly unusual post-mortem mutilation served absolutely no practical purpose, existing only to fulfill a dark, incomprehensible ritual within the killer's own mind. The cumulative effect of these discoveries birthed a sheer psychological terror that gripped the entire city of Austin. The foundational human concept of safety had been utterly shattered. Citizens were forced to confront the insidious reality that their locked doors, closed windows, and the seemingly impenetrable haven of their own beds could not protect them. A phantom was freely roaming their properties, capable of slipping into a room, silencing a life, and vanishing back into the void before the first light of day. Fear became a tangible, suffocating presence in the air, transforming the once optimistic capital into a city of terrified insomniacs. Families began sleeping in the same room, weapons drawn and loaded, jumping at the sound of the wind. The working-class communities were paralyzed by grief and a profound sense of abandonment, while the upper echelon of society watched from their mansions with a growing, uneasy realization. The phantom of the night was growing bolder with every successful slaughter, refining his technique and leaving the Austin police entirely devoid of answers. And while the privileged elite still comforted themselves with the belief that this nightmare was confined strictly to the margins of society, the killer was already looking toward new horizons, preparing to cross a societal boundary that would plunge the entire state into unprecedented, blinding hysteria. The panic reached a fever pitch on the night of December 24th, 1885. While families prepared for Christmas, seeking solace from the encroaching darkness in the glow of holiday hearths, the killer stalked the snowy streets with a new target in mind. For nearly 12 months, the affluent citizens of Austin had successfully insulated themselves from the terror, retreating behind the gates of their grand estates and convincing themselves that the violence was an isolated plague upon the marginalized. But as the temperature dropped and the city settled into what should have been a silent, holy night, the phantom was preparing to violently rewrite the rules of his own gruesome game. The first strike of the evening occurred at the residence of Susan Hancock, a highly respected white woman living in a comfortable, middle-class neighborhood. Susan represented the very demographic that had previously felt entirely immune to the Annihilator's wrath. As she slept peacefully within the confines of her own home, the invisible assailant penetrated the property with his terrifying, customary silence. Employing the same devastating methodology that had claimed the lives of the servant girls, the killer delivered a crushing blow with an axe, dragging her bleeding body out into the freezing winter yard to perform his dark rituals. The sheer audacity of attacking a prominent white woman within the main walls of her residence immediately shattered the fragile illusion of safety that the upper classes had so desperately clung to. Yet, the night of horror was far from over. In an unprecedented display of bloodlust and psychopathic confidence, the killer struck a second time before the sun could rise. The next victim was Eula Phillips, a young, wealthy white woman residing in one of Austin's most exclusive and heavily guarded districts. The attack mirrored the brutal efficiency of the previous murders, complete with the signature posing of the body and the chilling insertion of a sharp object into the victim's ear. Striking twice in a single night and deliberately targeting the protected elite demonstrated a level of terrifying stamina and brazenness that left local law enforcement entirely paralyzed. This dual tragedy represented a horrifying twist in the phantom's established pattern. The killer had decisively broken his own mold. The terrifying realization that absolutely no one in Austin was safe, regardless of race, class, or geographic location, swept through the capital like a seismic shockwave. The invisible, sociological barrier that the wealthy had constructed between themselves and the violence was obliterated in a matter of hours. The psychological devastation was absolute. The killer had definitively proven that wealth, societal status, and sprawling estates offered absolutely zero protection against his acts. When morning finally broke, the festive carols and holiday greetings were entirely replaced by the frantic, chaotic ringing of alarm bells and the sickening news of a double homicide. The juxtaposition of Christmas joy, a time traditionally reserved for peace, reflection, and familial comfort, with the bloodiest, most horrific night in the city's history, created a communal trauma that would scar Austin for generations. Families who had purchased gifts and prepared lavish feasts instead found themselves boarding up their windows and arming themselves with whatever weapons they could procure. The city was no longer just frightened. It had descended into absolute, suffocating hysteria. The wealthy power brokers of Austin, who had previously dismissed the murders as a localized issue beneath their concern, now found themselves staring into the same abyss that had consumed the servant community. They demanded immediate, absolute retribution, leveraging their political and financial influence to mobilize every available resource. With the city's elite now bleeding in their own backyards, the authorities were forced to take unprecedented measures. In the aftermath of the Christmas Eve massacre, Austin descended into absolute hysteria. The local police force, entirely unequipped to handle a methodical serial murderer of this unprecedented magnitude, initiated a desperate and sweeping crackdown across every district. Officers scoured the city with frantic urgency, ultimately arresting and questioning over 400 men in connection with the brutal slayings. The suspect pool was remarkably broad, ranging from local vagrants and estranged boyfriends to prominent politicians and wealthy businessmen. Yet every grueling interrogation ended in a frustrating dead end. The citizenry, grappling with the terrifying realization that official law enforcement could no longer guarantee their safety, took matters into their own hands. Armed vigilance committees were hastily formed in nearly every ward, organized by desperate fathers and husbands. Men of all social classes stood guard on their porches and patrolled the alleyways with loaded shotguns, revolvers, and rifles, staying awake through the freezing nights to protect their trembling families, effectively transforming the once quiet capital into a tense, militarized zone. As the local authorities flailed under the immense public and political pressure, city officials made a desperate plea for outside intervention, eventually securing the services of the renowned Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Founded in the 1850s, the Pinkertons were widely considered the premier investigative force in the United States, possessing a vast network of informants and a level of experience that far exceeded those of any municipal police department. They arrived in Texas, bringing the promise of professional rigor to a city paralyzed by a seemingly unstoppable predator. However, even the most elite and highly trained detectives of the late 19th century were severely handicapped by the deeply primitive state of forensic science. The investigative tools and scientific methodologies that modern law enforcement inherently relies upon were entirely non-existent in the winter of 1885. There was no DNA profiling to analyze the biological evidence left behind at the gruesome crime scenes. The concept of criminal psychological profiling, which might have helped investigators narrow down the suspect pool by analyzing the killer's bizarre ritualistic behavior, had not yet been conceived. Furthermore, human blood typing would not be discovered until 1901, and the systematic use of fingerprinting to identify suspects was still nearly 2 decades away from being officially adopted by American courts. The crime scenes, though brutally graphic, were scientifically mute. Without these critical technological advancements, the Pinkerton agents and local police were forced to rely almost exclusively on traditional boots-on-the-ground policing. They conducted exhaustive interviews, followed up on localized gossip, and heavily depended on circumstantial hearsay. Authorities brought in packs of specially trained bloodhounds, hoping the animals could track the killer's scent from the bloody backyards of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips out into the surrounding Texas wilderness. Yet, time and time again, the dogs would relentlessly follow a scent, only to lose the trail completely at the edge of the paved carriage roads or along the muddy banks of the Colorado River, acting as if the perpetrator had simply evaporated into the cold winter air. The sheer frustration of the investigation was palpable, creating a deep psychological toll on the investigators and the public alike. Despite the heavy presence of armed citizen patrols on every street corner, the deployment of specialized tracking hounds, and the arrival of the absolute best detectives the country had to offer, the killer remained entirely elusive. He navigated through the heavily guarded, snow-covered streets like an invisible phantom, exhibiting an almost supernatural ability to evade detection. He left behind absolutely no physical trace of his true identity, no accidentally dropped weapons, and no surviving witnesses who could provide a reliable physical description to authorities. This total investigative gridlock plunged the city into a profound, suffocating state of despair, generating a deeply atmospheric dread that was quietly being documented by an observant local resident who would soon share that very terror with the entire world. Among the terrified residents of Austin during this unprecedented bloodbath was a 23-year-old man named William Sidney Porter, an observant young clerk who would later become world-famous under the beloved literary pen name O. Henry. In the mid-1880s, long before he penned classic American short stories like The Gift of the Magi, Porter was living a relatively ordinary life in the Texas capital, working as a draftsman at the General Land Office and playing in a local string band. However, his sharp writer's eye was already keenly tuned to the psychological unraveling of the society around him. As the brutal murders escalated and the city descended into a heavily armed, paranoid state, Porter found himself serving as an unofficial, deeply perceptive chronicler of the hysteria. Through a series of personal letters dispatched to his friends and family outside the state, Porter documented the sheer atmospheric dread that had completely paralyzed the capital. His correspondence provides a remarkably vivid primary source window into the daily reality of living in an active hunting ground. He described a community held hostage by the setting sun, noting how the dirt streets would empty rapidly at dusk and how the freezing night air was constantly pierced by the nervous barks of tracking hounds and the occasional, panicked gunshot of a jumpy vigilante. In his writings, the usually witty and light-hearted young man conveyed the grim, inescapable tension of a population that had entirely lost its sense of safety, capturing the collective exhaustion of citizens who were staying awake all night to stand guard over their trembling families. It is within these deeply personal historical documents that a fascinating intersection of true crime and literary history occurs. The press of the era had struggled to appropriately label the elusive phantom terrorizing their streets, often using sensational but generic terms like the Midnight Assassin or simply the Unseen Fiend. But it was William Sidney Porter who ultimately gave the unidentified monster his permanent, chilling title. In a letter dated May 10, 1885, addressed to his friend Dave Hall, Porter discussed the ongoing police investigation and the town's fearful excitement, casually referring to the unknown assailant with a phrase that perfectly encapsulated the horror of the crimes. He dubbed the killer the Servant Girl Annihilator. This specific moniker, coined by one of America's most celebrated future authors, was profoundly accurate in its dark descriptive power. It acknowledged the specific, marginalized demographic that the killer had originally preyed upon during the early months of his rampage, while the word annihilator perfectly captured the absolute, devastating physical destruction inflicted by the heavy iron axe. The name eventually bled from Porter's private letters into the broader public consciousness, becoming the definitive historical title for the phantom murderer and cementing the tragedy in the annals of American crime. The fact that a legendary American writer was intimately present for and forever marked by the horrific reality of the country's first true serial killer adds a profound historical layer to the narrative. Porter's presence in Austin during the slaughter serves as a surreal anchor, connecting a beloved figure of classical literature to a forgotten, gruesome chapter of extreme, unsolved violence. Long before the Whitechapel murderer was christened Jack the Ripper by the sensationalist London press in 1888, the Austin killer had already been named by a young man who would eventually become an undisputed master of the twist ending. Yet in this particular, grim chapter of his own life, there would be no clever resolution, no satisfying narrative closure, and no dramatic unmasking of the villain. The young writer, much like the Pinkerton detectives and the terrified citizens of Texas, was left staring into a void, waiting for a final chapter that would simply never be written. After the unprecedented brutality of the Christmas Eve murders, the terrified city of Austin braced for a continuation of the carnage. Instead, the killings abruptly stopped. As quickly and silently as he had arrived, the Servant Girl Annihilator simply vanished into the annals of history. Despite the hundreds of arrests, the immense financial rewards offered by the state, and the tireless efforts of the renowned Pinkerton detectives, the Phantom was never definitively identified. The investigation eventually grew cold, the armed citizen patrols disbanded, and the horrifying murders of 1884 and 1885 remain officially unsolved to this very day. The legacy of this elusive killer casts a long, dark shadow over the evolution of criminal history. It is a striking historical fact that this meticulous reign of terror unfolded 3 full years before Jack the Ripper began his infamous campaign in the fog-drenched streets of London's Whitechapel district. This grim timeline effectively establishes the Austin killer as America's earliest documented serial murderer of such magnitude and psychological complexity. Yet, unlike many notorious figures of true crime who were eventually captured, tried, or killed, the Annihilator successfully outsmarted the primitive justice system of his era. The most chilling reality of this entire saga is the overwhelming probability that this brutal psychopath simply walked away from the blood-soaked snow of Texas. He likely lived out the remainder of his natural life as a free, seemingly respectable man, peacefully blending into another community and taking the dark secrets of his midnight atrocities to the grave. You've been listening to my channel. If you'd like to support the show, leaving a thumbs up, a comment, or a review really helps the channel grow. You can also join me on Patreon for ad-free, audio-only episodes, or sign up for my free newsletter on my website to keep up with the latest news and historical releases. All the necessary links are down in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again soon.